webinar is about emptiness, and so I hope the landscapes I'm talking about are not too empty. Well, they are in a certain way empty, but I will go on with that. Yeah, so what you see here on the first picture are three images. The first one says fashionably old-fashioned. The second one says sense of history, and the third one is pure nature. These are pictures that are from a website from the community of Whimsy, which is known for most Estonians, of course, as being left-sided of east of Tallinn. And Whimsy is one of the most prospering suburbs of Tallinn communities in Estonia. And of course, from Whimsy, from the nature, you look back to the city, as we can see in the background of fashionably old-fashioned fashioned. And Whimsy itself on this website gives itself an image of a landscape that is beautiful from where you look from the outside to the inside, from where you can really recreate, where you can really settle down. Now, if we know about the history of Whimsy a bit more, then we find out that Whimsy is about this. And actually, this is where the emptiness starts. Whimsy, of course, isn't empty, but the idea of Whimsy that actually was thought about, was mentioned for many years, is more or less empty. It's not there anymore. People are not talking about that. So what we see here is this house here, which is now renovated. A lot of houses in Whimsy are gone. What is that? Whimsy was for many years in the Soviet times part of the so-called Whimsy Kirov fishing kolkhoz, and it was founded in the year 1951, and since then until 1989 it worked as a fishing kolkhoz. It was one of the typical kolkhoz agriculture, kolkhoz cattle, kolkhoz fishing companies in Estonia. And what Whimsy was also standing for, it was standing for an urban lifestyle in a rural setting, a complete new way of agriculture, of farm society, something where the economy not just changed, but also the whole society changed. So the people who were working in Whimsy were working in a fishing company, and of course they worked in a so-called countryside profession, but they were living an urban lifestyle, as was mentioned at that time. So it was part, of course, of the kolkhoz and sovkhoz farms in Estonia. And what we see here is a map of the kolkhoz and sovkhoz farms around Tartu as they were projected in 1960. So what we see is Tartu, as the black dot in the middle, has a very small, is very small compared to the big kolkhozes around there. So you can see that there's actually an agricultural structure which is completely new, which has nothing to do with the old idea of European farming or of the farming that was existing in Estonia for about 20 years before the collectivization came when Estonia was part of the Soviet Union. This was a new layout of the whole landscape. So part of this, of course, is not only the layout and the planning, not only that the whole economy was working different, also, of course, it generated new ways of living. And as you can see here on these three pictures, maybe one of them is known for you from a video. These are typical places that were built in the years from the 1950s until the 1980s in the Estonian countryside. This is how the Estonian countryside actually marketed itself as a place of modernity, something that is modern, something that leads to the future, something that is different than the old agriculture that was connected with the Estonian Republic. And of course, this was the idea of the kolkhoz ideology, and of also the idea of mixing actually the rural and the urban. So of course, for many people, this made a difference. So we have a modernist achievement with that. It brought electricity to the countryside, and we've seen that before on the first slide. It brought recreational places for the people. So people had holidays the first time. People worked. People lived in houses, multi-story houses with toilets in it, with bathrooms in it. People had 8 hours work days or 10 hours work days. People had holidays. People had places where they could buy things like this store down there. And of course, with that, the whole countryside looked a bit different. It looked not only it didn't just have a larger scale in the way of its layout, of its plan. It also had a larger scale in the way of its appearance. So that's what we now might call the Estonian mastic, the landscape that we have. Of course, this landscape for us, as it was mentioned at the beginning, is a bit empty, because the idea behind the landscape, the ideology behind that, the idea behind the Kolchos agriculture is gone. And for most of you, you have nothing to do with that anymore, because it's gone since almost 30 years. But of course, as I said, the remains are there, and the remains in some ways are also leading towards our time. So here we have the agricultural school in Yeneda, which was built in the early 1970s. And this agricultural school at that time, of course, was part of a new network of schools that was built, that was laid out for training actually new experts in in agriculture, which would deal with these bigger agricultural units. And the agricultural school in Yeneda, of course, still exists. And our school that we are at, the Estonian University of Life Science, was also built in this way, and also was laid out in this way, was planned in this way, was established as being a school for training new experts in agriculture. So one land is gone, the other land is built on top of that. And this is also what this architecture of this agricultural school in Yeneda is communicating towards us. When we look further and we look on how this was culturally actually reflected by the people, then a very important picture in this is this picture of the collective farm girl on a bike. It is from Soviet Russia from 1935, and what we see is a typical big, large-scale landscape of the Soviet landscape, but it is all built, it's all fruitful, it's full of everything is in bloom. And what we also see is we see a woman. We see a woman in a red dress with sneakers on, riding on a man's bike. So here we have all the idea that is behind the positive side, or the wanted positive side of the new collective farm ideology. The idea that men and women would be living together, would be working together. They would be equal. They would get equal pay. They would have equal times, and they would be on this new farm. And the old farm idea, the romantic farm idea, is gone. The old farm idea, also the farm work, is gone. The work where somebody, of course, is owning the land, but is also responsible for himself. All this is gone. The new collective is existing. Now, all of this, of course, is a desire. And the progressive landscape as a desire is something that runs out throughout, that runs through the whole 20th century. The progressive landscape is something that has been thought about, that has been planned in many different European countries, whether they have a Soviet background or whether they have a fascist or even a democratic background. The idea is there is a progressive landscape where we can link the positive sides of the urban, of the rural, the planning together with the ideas of the home landscapes, and build this up. And these two pictures, one is from Germany. It's from a city called Eisenhüttenstadt, so it means Iron Hut City, and the other one from Russia show this very well. So you have both images, both icons of each landscape. On one hand, the big steelworks, and in the front, the farmers working. So it means, like, let's get rid of the rural past. Now, what we see today in the year 2020 is we see a post-progressive landscape. So many things, many of these places, of these buildings, of the whole infrastructure that was built is in decline. But also for us ourselves, it is like the term post-progressive or post-Soviet, when we say, it also unfolds this desire. We want to leave this past behind. And that's why we take our view away from these kind of landscapes. These landscapes remind us of something that we don't want to do, don't want to have something to do with. But of course, they also remind us of the time of our fathers or grandfathers, mothers and grandmothers. And sometimes some of these elements are really small, and they are also a reminder of the idea of bringing actually something like bringing the urban rhythm to the countryside. Like this bus station here near Cesis in Latvia, which was built in a very postmodern style, built in the probably late 1980s, maybe even after that, after the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. And of course it says like, well, this is a bus station. It's in the middle of nowhere. But when you come from your farm and you go here and you take the bus, then you're already part of the city. And of course, all these kind of elements sometimes only give us a small glimpse almost of what was important once. So this picture here is a picture of a former basketball field in Ulila. And it is also in the middle of nowhere, and one wonders why was a basketball field built up somewhere here in the woods, where the woods actually, like on this picture, is already coming back, and the grass and all the vegetation is coming through it. So this is this kind of post-progressive decline that we can see almost everywhere in Estonia, in the Baltics, and in many countries that are connected to what we call former Eastern Europe. Like this all abandoned farmland in the Kaliningrad Oblast in Russia, where you actually drive with a car about 50 or 70 or 80 kilometers through a landscape which is completely open, where you expect there would be farmland, but actually many of the farmland is simply abandoned and it's just cut once or twice a year. And of course, if we go further on, then we can already identify certain buildings, but also we can connect these buildings with this idea that I talked about before. So these are some pictures from the Omedu fake caviar factory, and maybe some of the students from Estimaölik will know that quite well because you've been taken there maybe with Gloria's course. And of course, until the 1980s, this was working for a very short time as an idea of this modernity. So it was built up as we can see from the pictures, as a building that could be also maybe in the proximity of Tallinn or of Tartu. And when we take a look at this picture down there, we can see that it's in the middle of the woods. And again, the whole landscape also surrounding it is built up for this decision to have a caviar factory right in the middle of the woods here, which was actually a part or an outer part of this whimsy factory that I talked about before. So again, we have these connections like on the planning level, but we also have the connections by decisions that were made to build something there. And of course, when it was built and when it was supposed to be working really full, the Soviet Union declined. So we have these buildings and landscapes which are dismantled of their function, or they're even destroyed, and now they can serve as museum material. But now, and this is where the emptiness actually ends, is people and their lives lived are still there. How do we make this landscape speak? How do we make the past speak through the landscape? And this is the second part that I'm going to talk about today. We have a documentary movie here in front of us of celebrating 25 years of Rauge Sofjos farm. It was made in 1983, and you can still see it on YouTube. And you see this movie, and you see also how they actually celebrated themselves. So at that time, it was 25 years. So many people who worked on this kolchos already had a life there. They started there maybe as young experts, maybe young milkers, tractorists, got married on this kolchos, and they said like, well, this is the life that we're living. This is the new reality for us. And in the movie, we can see many different lives. Of course, it was a propaganda movie, but it is staged with real people. of course, if we make a distinction, then we can say like a village is building. In the village, there are people living, like there's neighborhoods. People are having their own places. People are building in these cultural villages are building their own private life. But also in the same way, the village shows off. And of course, after 1989, the village is still there. This is an example from Germany. Sorry, I just forgot to talk about that. These are pictures from a culture's farm in Germany. And now we take a look at that. And after 1989, now 30 years ago, all this is still there. And some things are still running, as this shed that you can see up there, which is rented out to somebody who owns 3 combines and harvests the crops in the summer. While most of it, of course, is just laying there and is waiting to be sold, or is just another village, which doesn't have this kind of story that shows it, that is showing up anymore. So these kind of built and planned remains of collective heritage are something to cope with. And the other thing is there is a need to cope with these remains as a collective task. So the challenge and dilemma of labeling these remains as retro but useless. That is the other point. We say they're useless and they're maybe reminder of something and they're retro, but on the other hand, they're of course part of a landscape, and landscape is something that is of course in progress, something that is something in process, that needs progress, that needs maintenance. So we need to focus on 3 aspects: introducing methods for perceiving and assessing these kind of modernist rural landscapes, to raise awareness on the topic in the society, lay people, and to discuss the importance for our profession. And what I'm going to talk about now is part of my research, and also of part, and has been until last year, part of a research where me and especially Simon Bell and Marty Verdi and Kaya Vettel were part of a research team that was dealing with these kind of landscapes, and how we actually are looking at these landscapes, how we are understanding these landscapes, not only by the elements, but of the lives and the memories of the people who are living there. So how do we do that? First of all, of course, we need to see the landscape as something that is built up on each other, but it's not just layers on top of each other, not like destroy the past and then something new comes. Actually, landscape is a palimpsest in this way. So it means something where you ride through, and where you always can see the traces of the last past, or of some long gone past in the new landscape. And by Hoskins, there was a very famous book made in the 1950s about the making of the English landscape. And it was actually a book that you could just buy, and people could read that and say like, okay, well, this is about landscape. So it's not a scientific book. It's a book that says like, well, our landscape is building up from the past until today. And of course, if we take a look at that, then we can say like, well, we have these different layers. And in Germany, we have this word Geschichte. Geschichte is a layer. And Geschichte means history. History, a story, a storage of something, storing something. Schicht, a layer. So what we have is Geschichten verstrickt, which means in German, entangled in stories. To be entangled in stories. So we have different kinds of stories, and these different kinds of stories build up what we call the story of a region, and that builds up history. So history is made of different people's entanglements. Another example of that would be a picture by Jackson Pollock. And what he does is actually, he did his, as he called it, action painting. He did his pictures in that way that he said like, well, the picture is never done. The picture is an open artwork. What we can see is me just painting the picture in the process. And that's what we do. We paint the picture, we build layer on top of each other, and we always just glimpse a small period in time. So what we do is we perceive this changing landscape by combining assessment practices. When we assess the landscape, it refers to its actions and to its actors. This unfolds potentials by perceiving actions of stakeholders and their spatial relations. how to do that. First of all, we have to dive into the landscape. And the German philosopher Gerhard Böhme said, we must be physically present to experience space, something that we can't do right now, for instance. By inhabiting space, we can sense the character that surrounds us, we sense its atmosphere. Interpretation of space can't compare to the experience and the interaction in space. So what he says is we can map a place, a space. We can gather data about all this. But what we need also, we need to experience the space to find something out. We need to experience ourselves. So we have to be part of the space ourselves, to experience the atmosphere, to actually also to understand the layers that I was talking about. So here is an example of different steps how to deal actually with these kind of landscapes that I was just talking about. So these apparent constituents of the landscapes are mapped, the elements of the landscape, the infrastructure, the landscape itself, how it appears to us with videos and sound samples by moving around in the landscape on foot over the car. And then another point that we did was the active constituents of the landscape are surveyed by interviews. So we wanted to find out who actually is still there, who is active or who has been active, but who still lives in these landscapes, who still fills up the emptiness. So what we have down here is an itinerary of how this would be done by a drive along, as we can see it here, a look inside, a look around, look inside of buildings, for instance, look outside of a building, look inside to a building, look through the landscape, talking about the landscapes and going along in the landscape. And doing this with an interviewer, with a researcher, and building up connections by this. So what we see here is the way how this is done. By diving in, for instance, into the area with objections about the route, creating a continuous space to be mapped. Going through, taking a look at what is around you, but walking through maybe with somebody else, talking about what you see in front of you and filming all this. And what you see down here are screenshots from filming of this Omedo fake courier factory that we did 2 years ago when we went through these through this place. So we also recorded the sound and how we moved along there and the traces of people there. So this is the first glimpse into the place. This is happening together with the drive-through. So this is, as you can see here, people are sitting in a car, both together. It's a bit like you know it from carpool karaoke. So you go through a landscape and you talk about what you see, and and by this you already map the landscape because you're in the landscape. So you create the landscape as a journey. And these are again like small screenshots from this LPG center in Germany, which was one of the case studies of this research. Then the next step is looking around. So after we see the landscape as a journey, as a travel, we can stop at certain points and we look around and we do what we would normally do in the landscape. We would look around. We would say like, hey, where are we? And we turn around and we film this, or we look inside, or we look outside. So we go to these buildings that reflect these times of the Soviet landscape, the post-Soviet buildings, and we walk into them, and we film them in the way like movement cycles. So we say like, well, what happens if somebody goes to work in the morning? Like he comes out of a house, comes out of a living house, goes somewhere outside, goes to the place where he or she works, or going to school. So what we're trying is remodeling an atmosphere of everyday life to link the space and the people's action. So here we have already the people's action brought into much more than just us being in the landscape. It's also we simulate other people being in the landscape. And now in the second step, what we did is we talk about the landscape. So there are two different ways of doing it. One was we look in the landscape with somebody by looking on the map. And these are stills here that were actually from an interview that was taken by Kaya Fedel for her masterwork that she defended 2 years ago. And it's where we did an interview with a former accountant in Axie who was living in Axie, who was working in Axie, and who was then bringing her memories to the map, bringing her memories to the place. It was understood that, of course, we couldn't walk around with her, but by putting the map there and also showing her pictures, we could trigger her memories and connect them with the space. And then the last part is the go-along interviews. So in these go-along interviews, we bring together the information from the interviews, from the look around, from the different data that we collected also by GIS, and the films and pictures that we did, and take this as a basis for a semi-structures interview that we do outside with the people. So we walk with the people through their landscape. So here you can see how me and my colleague Marti Veldi walk around with 2 former workers in this Omedu fish farm, and they talk about what they actually, how the life or how their work was happening every day. And so they gave us some insight of these buildings, and suddenly, when you do this, these buildings are trying to talk. They're starting to talk. They speak to you. So they're not empty anymore. Of course, there's nobody working in them, but you can see that there's actually something happening just beyond the stones and the concrete. And here's an example of that, like with these small screenshots where we walk with somebody in Laeva through the place, and she actually came from Laeva, but she's also an expert with a cultural, not geographer, with a anthropologist, and walking through the place and talking about the landscape as it appears to her. And of course, by walking along, we also put out questions that we have prepared after we were driving through the landscape, which of course we built up with our previous knowledge. And the same happens here underneath with a screenshot from driving through. So I was sitting in the back with the camera, and they were both talking in Estonian about the landscape that appears to us. And then at the end, of course, we transcribed this interview, and we had the films of this. So by this, we could also link again these the information with the space. So what does that mean? By this, we would build up knowledge about modernist rural landscapes, but on the same time, we will build up an identity, maybe a hidden identity of these modernist rural landscapes. And it would be a landscape in the way of not only a sheet, but also not a book, as I was mentioning before, where the layers are on top of each other but need to be uncovered. The idea would be then that the landscape is actually forming a building. So in this way, the sides of the book, by these different approaches of actually pulling out the memories of from the people and getting this data, would build a building where to put action in the best way, where something new could be thought about, or something also could be just taken away or taken as a museum object. So the idea of this would be to create awareness towards this landscape for future development, and in return, giving something back to their inhabitants and their stakeholders, which is also something that you do when you interview somebody, because somebody, of course, is proud of talking about his or her landscape. Even if it's not always the most beautiful landscape, but in their case, it's also the landscape where they made a living and where they were working. Thank you very much.